There is a change that happened in some West Germanic languages that has obscured the relationship between a whole set of words. I would like to explore that change and reveal a connection that you might not know about. All modern Germanic languages, English being one of them, are descended from a language spoken by the Germanic tribes in the Bronze Age. Linguists call this language Proto-Germanic. They were spread out across southern Sweden, southern Norway, and Denmark. Over time, they migrated south into Central Europe. Some went east, and their language changed over time, eventually becoming Gothic. Those that stayed in Central Europe became Germans, Austrians, Swiss, Dutch, and Belgians. Some of the Germanic tribes left Central Europe for the British Isles, and they were the ancestors of the English. Those that stayed in Scandinavia eventually became the Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, Icelanders, and Faroe Islanders. As the Germanic peoples spread out, they took their Germanic language with them, and it changed bit by bit over time, as do all languages. Linguists group the Germanic languages into three major branches: West Germanic of Central Europe and the British Isles, East Germanic of Eastern Europe, and North Germanic of Northern Europe, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. People learn language from their parents and from their peers. They pick it up around them. They eventually settle on some sort of baseline that they're able to use to communicate with others. They hear variations day by day and get used to a range of expression in their language. What this means is that people often don't notice changes happening right under their noses. Yeah, there are jokes made about how people over there speak or things like that, but generally, life goes on. However, those little differences grow over time and can result in once mutually intelligible forms of speech, those where both sides can understand each other, becoming completely unintelligible to one another. Different languages. English is one of the more divergent Germanic languages for several reasons. First of all, due to being separated by a sea from the mainland, this makes migration more difficult and slows down the spread of new forms of speech. This is also due to the fact that after those Germanic tribes arrived in Britain, they were then invaded again by Vikings, who by this point were speaking a slightly different version of that Germanic language, quite possibly Old Norse, and then again by the Normans, who spoke a different language entirely. However, some of the changes that occurred in English did happen in the other Germanic languages, and we can still find those connections today. Think about the letters T and P. T is pronounced at the front of the mouth, just behind the teeth. P is pronounced by putting your lips together and opening them suddenly, along with a burst of air. All sounds, of course, are made with the mouth, but there are some sounds that include another part of your body, which allows you to change how that sounds ever so slightly. The nose and its air pathways are connected to the mouth, and those pathways, just like your mouth, can be opened or closed to change the sound you're making. Pronounce the word think, and stop just before you get to k. Thing. Listen to the sound you make. That is a nasal sound. You create vibrations with your voice box and then push that sound through your nose, forming the sound we hear in think. There's another nasal sound in English, which is the sound at the end of thin. It's slightly different to the sound in think. The sound in think is the same as the in sing. The IPA, or International Phonetic Alphabet, has given this symbol to that sound and called it a velar nasal. Velar means the back part of the tongue is raised up against the soft palate, also known as the velum. The nasal part means that the sound is passed through the nose. The in thin is not a velar nasal, but an alveolar nasal, because it is pronounced in the alveolar ridge, that is the part of the mouth just behind the teeth. Even though both of these sounds are written using the letter N, it's immediately clear that they're completely different sounds. Pronouncing think sounds completely wrong. Okay, so now that we're clear about the different Germanic languages and how they developed, and we know about nasal sounds, we can look at the matter at hand. Let's look at the words tooth and the word tand from Swedish. I may or may not be pronouncing these correctly. I apologize if I'm not. They both mean the same thing, but you will notice an N in the Swedish word, but no N in the English word. How did the English lose that N? It was lost through a process called nasalization. This is where a vowel is pronounced through the nose and mouth instead of just the mouth. Modern English doesn't have nasalization, so the easiest way to explain it is to imagine looking at a delicious cake. You might say, Put your finger under your nose and feel the gentle flow of air as you make that sound. Think back to the in think. Notice again how air goes through your nose. Now imagine pronouncing a vowel while pushing your air through your nose like you do with and ng. This is what happens with French sang.
Did I pronounce that correctly?
5.
No, I did not.
You pronounce the vowel as you would any vowel, but you pass air through your nose, which changes the sound. When you pass air through your nose while pronouncing a vowel, that is referred to as nasalization. So, long ago, some group of Germanic speakers started nasalizing the vowel before an N. So uns became us. The vowel got lengthened so that it took the same amount of time to say as the previous un and was nasalized. Why was the vowel nasalized? Well, people often start speaking in a way that is simply easier for them. Think about the word bottle. If you live in America, like me, you probably actually say bottle with a d sound instead of bottle. This is because bottle is a bit easier to say than bottle. So sounds often change in a way that makes speech a little more fluid and makes words easier to say. Uns has 3 sounds in it: u, n, and s. Pronounce uns slowly for yourself and notice how your tongue moves around your mouth as you pronounce it. It has to be in one position for u, then another for n, and another for s. When you look at it this way, it's easy to see how it makes the word easier to pronounce when we combine that o and n sound into one. We now have a word that communicates the same meaning in only 2 sounds instead of 3. A massive savings of both time and effort. Speakers are always looking for easier ways to pronounce things. Minimizing effort is one of the many ways languages change over time. The final piece of the puzzle is that groups of speakers became separated, and changes don't always spread to all speakers. So once uns became us and people got used to it, they just decided to stop nasalizing it altogether, because that was even easier, and since everyone understood what us means, it just stuck. The word slowly changed from one form to the next and to the next, and speakers, in the moment, don't notice or care. Us is 2 steps removed from uns, no nasalization and no n, which means it is slowly drifting away from the original word. If this word were to go through more changes, it could eventually become completely unrecognizable. But as long as the speakers of the language were speaking it amongst themselves, they could all keep up to date, in a way, with the changes and still understand each other. Over large periods of time, the language will diverge from its cousins, but each group could still understand their peers, even if they couldn't understand their cousins. The subgroup of Germanic languages that applied this nasalization are called the North Sea Germanic group, or Ingvaeonic. The North Sea Germanic group includes English, Scots, Frisian, and Low German, also called Low Saxon. The oldest varieties of these languages are Old English, which is also the ancestor of Scots, Old Frisian, and Old Saxon. In the original language of the Germanic tribes, tooth was tanths. The th became a d in other Germanic languages, but English retained it. So tooth and tand are actually descended from the same word. In linguistics, we say those 2 words are cognate, from Latin cognatus, which means born together. We can look at words in English and compare them with words in German, and you'll see that, once again, there is an N present in German where there's none in English. See us versus uns, tooth versus zahn, other versus ander, goose versus gans, 5 and 5, soft and sanft. Languages like to mix, though, and we can see words in languages outside of the North Sea Germanic group that have lost the N, even though they weren't part of this nasalization process. The Proto-Germanic word for south was sunthras. This became suth in Old English and sundar in Old High German. Middle Low German was a very influential language at the time, and their word for south, which was Suden, eventually supplanted the Old High German form. Languages change over time, sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. A change in one language might be borrowed into a related language, and the 2 might remain quite similar. Other times, a group of languages, like the North Sea Germanic languages, might employ one change and run with it. The loss of N before a consonant was so complete in English that the only examples of N followed by another consonant are because the words had a different form at the time and only lost a vowel or consonant at a later point, bringing it to its current form. like the word month, which was originally monath. I love learning about things like this, because it makes me feel more connected to my native language and realize that English is not as far removed from its brethren as it first appears.